Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a basic users training and outcome tracker. This training is being brought to you by ACWS, the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a provincial member-based organization that represents 37 domestic violence shelters across Alberta. Actually 37 organizations representing many more shelters, and our role is to support collective action-based research, advocacy, and promising practices development for our collective on an ongoing basis. So with me today is my colleague Christoph Peck. Christoph, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Christoph, and if you have any questions about Outcome Tracker or you need help with your database, you will email otsupport@acws.ca, and it will almost certainly be me that you will be contacting at that email address. Sometimes if I go on vacation or take a day off, Kat will man that inbox, but usually it's me. And so, yeah, if you have any questions, you will probably be speaking to me, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. And my name is Kat Van Willingen, and I'm the Research and Projects Advisor with ACWS. I've been with the organization for over 4 years. And prior to that, I worked with the YWCA of Calgary, a member organization of the network. So I have been supporting staff with data entry in this database for 7 years at this point. Yeah, so I guess to start things off, I'm just going to take you through sort of our plan for today, the goals for this training, and as well as introduce you to the new draft of the manual that we've updated to reflect some changes that have happened over the last couple of years with our shared data set and changes within the database itself. So. Okay, so for those of you who are new and haven't attended a webinar before, the way the format works is that your microphones will be muted, and that's just to manage any feedback or noise that can happen when a lot of microphones are activated on one of these calls when we have a lot of attendees. So there is a questions pop-up that you can use to relay questions at any time. We're going to take regular breaks to address questions that come in. So just send them as they come up, and we'll get to them hopefully while they're relevant. And anything that we can't answer today, we will note to get back to you as soon as possible. And also note that this webinar and all of our webinars are recorded and then shared on our ACWS member support YouTube channel, so they're available to review later if you want to double check something that we discussed, or look at any of the other trainings that we've provided, or training videos that we've developed to support you with your work in the database. So yes, there is a screenshot of questions pop-up that you can use. So a bit of a disclaimer before we dive in. It's important to know that we work in a general design of the database that kind of reflects everything possible with an outcome tracker that has been designed within our network. This doesn't mean that all of the content that you see in our site will be reflected in your shelter. You may find that the layout looks a little bit different because customizations have happened in your site, and that's totally okay. So just know that you may have some following up to do with some of the more knowledgeable staff at your shelter who know the database and know kind of the nuances of what your sites look like compared to ours. You'll also see a lot of tabs that you likely don't have in your site, and hopefully that's not too confusing for you, but we'll let you know kind of what is most common across all shelters, and that will be the content that we focus on today. Okay, so topic-wise, we are going to cover our support resources and protocols that are available to you and that we request that you use as you encounter challenges in the database or have questions about your work in the database. So we'll be looking at logging into Outcome Tracker and how to troubleshoot common login errors, how to access existing records in the database, as well as create new records for new clients. Basic data entry, and there's two ways to enter data in Outcome Tracker. It's on you can enter on a tab, or you can enter through what's called an activity. So we'll review both those processes. We'll address common data entry errors and some tips on how to avoid them. We'll look at designing relationships between women and the children that are admitted to shelter or admitted to a program with them. And then we will discuss some management considerations for records that have multiple admissions in your shelter, because there are some important things to note for recurring clients or clients who access more than one program concurrently or back-to-back. Our goals for you are that you're able to log into Outcome Tracker and troubleshoot your login issues. You're comfortable with a lot of the basics of data entry that are relevant to your role, which includes linking families and where to access different data entry tools that you need in the database. And again, that you are aware of the common data entry errors and you understand how to treat those multiple admissions, and that you are comfortable to follow up with any of your support needs with our resources and protocols that we discussed today. Okay, so our first topic is the OT support resources. So as Christoph mentioned, we do have the OT support at acws.ca email. So that is where you can connect with us, and we manage a queue of requests that come in from shelters addressing issues or concerns that arise. So our protocol around contacting OT support is that each shelter has a designated staff person who is your OT administrator, and hopefully you're familiar with this individual. This person is sort of the first point of contact when shelter staff encounter a data entry issue. So we ask that you first bring those issues to your OT administrator to see if they can be resolved. If they can't be resolved within your shelter, within that team, then that OT administrator will connect with us directly and we'll work with them to address the issue to the best of our abilities. Sometimes we encounter what are called system-wide issues, and those are issues that have to do with the database itself as it's managed by our database provider. And so then it's our responsibility to liaise with the database provider and communicate back to you progress on that issue. So that's sort of the flow of our OT support protocol. I mentioned the ACWS member support YouTube channel. So we have a number of training videos and recordings available there. And they can be a nice, quick resource for you if you just want an immediate option for or an immediate response to a question that comes up about data entry. And then, of course, we have our Outcome Tracker manual, which I will open for you now. And just a sec, I'll make this nice and big for everybody and we'll go right back to the top. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to hide this so we can see as much as possible. So I've included the Outcome Tracker manual as an attachment or a handout on this presentation, and it's available for you to download directly from the webinar. And we'll also be circulating this to the membership as an email attachment, so you can also access it that way. But I just want to review on a high level sort of what the contents are here. So this version of the manual is really focused on what we call basic users, and these are staff that typically just use Outcome Tracker for data entry, data review, so managing and reviewing client records, and then maybe some basic reporting on specific clients or their caseload, that type of thing. So that's the focus of this manual. So it covers a lot of what we discussed already. So outcome tracker support and knowledge transfer within your shelter, training opportunities, and then the basics of searching for records, creating new records, managing relationships, and then all of the data entry tools that are used commonly across all shelters. And then for each of these data entry tools, we have the data entry instructions, as well as notes and common definitions. So for questions on the forms that we get a lot of questions about, or that have standard definitions that have been developed by ACWS and its members, we've included those definitions in here for you for your reference as well. So this is a great reference tool. It will likely be updated frequently over the next few months, so we'll keep you posted as changes are made. We have a lot of new initiatives happening across the network in terms of research projects and database improvement plans. So stay tuned, and yeah, that will be communicated to you through your inbox and through your directors, your shelter directors. Okay. So I think, Christoph, do you have anything to add before we dive into Outcome Tracker and look at logging in?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Great. So our provider, the provider for Outcome Tracker, is a company called VistaShare. And the database itself is web-based, so it's hosted online, and you can access it using this address here, and it's also indicated for you in the manual. It's important to note the .ca, so it's not as relevant now. I believe VistaShare has moved to a cloud-based format for managing like all the data, but from a privacy point of view, having Canadian hosted servers and data storage was important for us as a network in terms of protecting women's privacy. So you may find that, so VistaShare has a .ca site and a .com site, and one of the first things we ask staff to confirm when they're logging in is that they've accessed the Canadian site. I'll actually just show you. So if you were to go to vistashare.ca and not directly to the login page, you have both a US login option and a Canadian option. Okay, so we'll log in here. So typically when a user account's created for you by the OT administrator at your shelter, the automated format is your first name, a period, and then your last name. And your password will be typically, I think, a minimum of 8 characters long, and we'll have at least one uppercase character and one number. A lot of us have many, many passwords floating around in our lives, so that's just maybe a friendly reminder that that could be one way to keep track of this password. You can set a default to have the system remember your username. Your shelter may or may not support this practice, so I think it's important to check in with your OT administrator to make sure that saving your username and password is appropriate. If you work on a shared computer, it's not appropriate. But if you have your own workspace in a secure space, then it may be appropriate to save your username and password. So again, on the login page, you do have the option to move back and forth between the US site and the Canadian site. So if you find it's asking you here to log into the Canadian site, then you're probably in the wrong place. If you log in and get an alert that you have invalid logging in credentials, and you've tried a couple of times and can't access your account, you do have the option here. So your outcome tracker login will be linked to hopefully your staff email, and you can send a password reset or a username reminder to your email address. And address any login concerns you're having that way. So I would say if you are having challenges logging into the database, that's the first step in trying to resolve the issue yourself, and then from there, reaching out to your OT admin for support would be the next appropriate step. Okay, so I'm going to log in here. Oh, I should mention that the username and passwords are case sensitive, so that can be another indication that, or another area you can troubleshoot if you're having issues logging in, is checking what case you're using for both your password and your username.
Yeah, so I just want to mention something before we move on.
Of course.
As Kat mentioned, the username is case sensitive, but the password is case sensitive, but the username is also case sensitive, which is not something you see all the time. So if you're having trouble logging in, make sure that your username is not doesn't have any capital letters in it, because by default it shouldn't. Although there are some cases where it would, but those are few and far between. Also, just one thing I want to clarify is that if you try to log into the US site as opposed to the Canadian site, your credentials won't work. So if you log in and you can't, if you try to access the site and you can't log in, and you're sure your password's right, you're sure your username's right, it might be that you're on the US site rather than the Canadian site. So just something to consider too when you are logging in and having difficulties.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is the first page you'll see when you log into Outcome Tracker. So My Vista is sort of what's considered like a dashboard page. Not a lot of shelters use it as a dashboard, but it's sort of a summary page of a lot of things that are going on in the database and a lot of features that you can or can't use. I'm just going to show you a few things that are helpful to you. So along the top right, there's information about your account here. So if you hover over your name, you can manage some of your preferences and update your password, that type of thing. Very rarely, we do have staff who use the same username and password for more than one site in Outcome Tracker. So each shelter has a unique site that's completely closed off to anyone else. It's just for managing their shelter information, but some staff do move between more than one site to manage data. So the site that you're in will be indicated here. These 3 A's allow you to adjust the font size display. So you probably are noticing the My Vista homepage is increasing in size. So this is just one way. If you prefer larger font or smaller font, you can customize the view of the database somewhat for you here. The print feature here will allow you to print any page. So that's more relevant once you're actually in a client record, but helpful nonetheless to know. And then again, logging out. So the login button is at the top right. And we do recommend if you're leaving your desk and working in Outcome Tracker that you save what you've done to the point that you're leaving and then log out to protect the information of individuals that you're working with. Because depending on your work environment, anyone can come along and use your computer and view information. So just another measure that staff can take to keep women's information and privacy secure. So along the top here, you'll notice a number of tabs. Again, I mentioned before that we have a lot of tabs because we're working in a network site, and both Christoph and I have administrator access to the network site. You will likely only see a reports tab, an activities tab, and a people and organizations tab, and maybe a few of these other ones. So like My Vista, news, and forums aren't widely used at all. The tabs that are most relevant to your work will be people and organizations, which is where we, I like to think of people and organizations as the filing cabinet, so where we go to add and access information for women and children. Activities is where the assessment tools and different sort of data entry activities that we use with women are organized as well. And then reports is where we can go and run aggregate data. So review data in larger batches to support, either reporting to funders or program development or that type of thing. So we're going to spend most of our time today in the People and Organizations tab. Now, before we dive in to this tab here and how it works, I think it might be a good time to just check in for any questions that have come up to this point, any questions about our support processes or some of the practices around security that we've mentioned. Has anything come in yet, Christoph?
No questions yet.
Okay.
That I can see. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So as I mentioned, People Organizations is our filing cabinet. It's where we go to search for existing client records or add new client records for those individuals who have not received services at our organization yet. So the way it's organized, every time someone is entered into the database, they get assigned what's called a role. And a role is typically fixed to sort of two things. It either reflects the program that they are being admitted to or added to, or it can reflect sort of a relationship they have to the shelter. So when I say relationship, I'm referring to, we have two roles that we use for non-clients who are seeking shelter services or program services. So we use caller and potential clients. So these are people who are not in a program, but are either phoning your crisis line or making contact with the shelter somehow to inquire about services or inquire about programming or needing support, crisis support. So a number of different non-client activities are documented using the caller or potential client role. So when you're working in people organizations, what you have up here are filtering options. So you can filter by role, and I mentioned a few of the common roles. So we have caller, potential client. We have residential roles for both emergency shelters and outreach, or second stage shelters, and then we also have outreach roles for both those shelter types as well. So you can choose to search for groups of clients based on the roles they have. So we have what's called the residential ACWS adult role. And this role is a standard role that's used across all shelters. And if we select that role, we can review lists of clients within the People Organizations tab. And with that list displayed, we can choose to click on any of the columns in the sort of mini spreadsheet that's displaying client information to organize it in different ways. So if I click on name, I'm looking at it in alphabetical order. If I click on it again, I'm looking at it in reverse alphabetical order. I could choose to sort by phone number. You may have other options displayed here, and that would allow you to organize your information in different ways and sort of review your whole list. So some shelters use this to kind of see everyone who's in-house at the moment, so they can select the active roles affiliated with a program and then look to see, you know, who's in shelter at a point in time. You can also sort, so there are active and inactive roles. We typically don't see shelters using the active or inactive status very often, so I won't focus too much attention on it. But basically you can set a role up so that it's only active, like when someone leaves a program, you can discharge them from the program, but you can also deactivate their role. Like I said, not many shelters are doing that. So I won't delve in much deeper, but if you do have questions about that, we can certainly discuss it more. So I'll follow up if a question comes up. And then we also have two types of, I guess, clients that can go in the database. So we have people, and that would be like women and children or staff, individuals. We also have organizations, and organizations typically, I would say, are managed in the caller role. So often shelters are receiving calls from community partners on behalf of women and children seeking services, or, you know, for other reasons. There's a lot of partnership work that happens in communities with shelters, and so tracking information about you know, calls that come in from your community partners could be very useful. And so you can choose to look at only organizations. So I will search for organizations, and you'll see, like, we manage information for all of our members here. In our database, you'll see the whole list of organizations show up. Now, most often, when you are searching in people and organizations, you're looking for a specific record. And so we advise that before you type anything into this search field here, that you review all of these options. So the kind, and you set it to all. You set the inactive, active to all, and then you select either all roles or the specific role you're looking for, if you prefer. But what that'll do is it'll ensure that whatever you type in here is looking, the database will look as broadly as possible in your site to find that information. When you start applying restrictions to where it looks, there's the opportunity to miss a record that is actually in there, but just not organized in the way that you've searched for it. So when everything's set to all, you will probably have the best luck finding an existing record in your database. So before we search for an existing record, I just want to point out two other things that are kind of helpful from a workflow point of view. What Outcome Tracker does is it keeps tabs on the right of recent searches you've done. So if you're working, you know, with a small caseload right now at a given point in time, it's sort of nice, rather than having to go through all the steps of searching if that record's in the database, then those individuals will just be listed here, and you can quick link. Oh, it doesn't seem to be working. Well, typically you would be able to link right into their record using the recents list. Okay, so I'm going to search for an existing record, and I'm just going to type in partially the name. Oh, here we go, look. I need to set the kind to all in order to find this individual. So I've typed in just the first name, Betty, and what's happened is all direct matches have shown up here, highlighted in the list, and then near matches have also shown up in the list. So Outcome Tracker does do a little bit of guesswork for you, which is a nice feature because often the first point of entry that an individual will have into the site is through a phone call. So typically before someone's admitted to a program, they first phone the program or reach out to the program somehow and ask for services. And it's not always possible to verify spelling of someone's name when you're on a crisis call with them. It may not be appropriate to confirm the spelling, or it may not be easy to hear them, or there are a number of factors that can make it difficult. So it's a good practice to search a few different ways. So maybe to search with an IE, maybe to search with a V, just as an example to sort of mitigate the risk of missing a record that's already in there because the name was misspelt. But we had it right the first time, so I'm going to go into Betty Boop's record. And what I'm actually going to do in the record is first kind of show you what's in here, but then address a scenario that is really just adding a case note to an existing record. And the reason why I'm going to kind of start at that point and look at a few of the ways that we would just update existing records is that often people attending this training aren't necessarily involved in every stage of data entry. They are crisis workers, or they are case managers at shelters who have dedicated data entry staff who really just need to use Outcome Tracker to update case notes and update assessments. So I'm going to start with these practices in case those of you who are seeking a really focused training only need that training, and then give you the option to stick around and learn as much as you like, but also, not necessarily have to wait through the entire training if that's the limit of what you need in terms of data entry training. So I'll go ahead with that. Any questions at this point, Christoph? Are we still all good?
No questions as of yet.
Okay, great. So what we have in the client file here, so you'll see we have those original tabs up along the top, and these are, again, this is the filing cabinet that we're in, people, organizations, and then within the client record, each tab is reflective of, would be comparable to a paper form that you might have in a paper file that looks at sort of one type of activity that you would do with a woman that you want to track kind of all together. So one example is, the intake form or the discharge form, and your shelter may have one standard intake that's used for all programs, or you may have an intake form that's for shelter and an intake form that's for outreach. Another example is the case notes tab that we mentioned before. So again, a lot of shelters will be entering a ton of case notes to document their contact and their support that they give to women and children in the shelter. And again, there's going to be a ton of tabs in here that aren't relevant to you. Another useful tab is the relationships tab. So in Outcome Tracker, you can design relationships between family members. So for moms admitted with children, you can connect children directly to mom and then use this tab to link back and forth between their records. So if I were to quickly add a relationship here, and I just want you guys to know that we don't have any real client information here. So you'll see names, and they're mostly fairy tale names. So don't worry about that. So now that I've added this relationship, I can link into Bobby's file through the relationships tab and then go back to Betty's file. So those of you working with families, it's a really nice sort of time saver. Rather than having to go back to people organizations to search for each family member every time, you can kind of flow through their records using this tab. So yeah, that's fairly straightforward. Some shelters manage documents in here. There are different activity tabs in here, but I'm going to go back to that case notes tab and review data entry for a case note. So I think before we talk about what's on the form itself, I'll just sort of talk through that workflow again. So this is for staff who know their clients have already been added to Outcome Tracker and need to manage just their contact and their work with that person in the database. So they've gone to people organizations, they've searched for that individual, they've successfully opened their record, and then they're going to the tab that they need to manage the information they need to manage for that individual. So within the data entry form itself, there is the data entry format, so the form itself, and then along the right here, and I'm just going to adjust the resolution a little bit because it's looking a little awkward. I've got it set too big. Make it a little smaller. Please send us a question or comment if that is too small and you can't see it clearly. But you'll see that, yes, so the form is here itself. And then we have a list of all of the case notes that have been created for this individual. So they're dated, they're listed most recent to least recent. And then the author information is there, and then the type of contact. So this is another feature that might be slightly different in your shelter. It is customizable, but typically this display here is intended to give you a bit of information to know what case note you're opening. So if you need to go back and review a colleague's case note, you can find that case note because their name will be referenced in this title. And if there's a number of case notes for that staff person in the same day, you might be able to identify it by the type of contact it is. And obviously the date is there as well. So you can go back to old case notes and you can review them here by clicking on this list. You can also create a new case note, and that's using the button at the top. So it's very important, particularly with case notes, that you are aware of this list, which entry is highlighted and indicated with this little blue arrow. And the reason for this is that it's very easy to overwrite an existing case note and not realize it. And unfortunately, it can be retrieved, but it's a lot of work to retrieve that lost data if you open up an old case note and write over it instead of creating a new one. So you'll notice one way to mitigate this, so this may be a feature in your site and may not be, is that there is a locking feature. And many shelters use this on case notes in particular. So you'll notice that this form that I'm in right now is totally grayed out. So I can't click on anything and update it. All this information is locked. It's basically like reviewing it in a PDF format. So a lot of shelters use this to kind of prevent the overwriting of case notes. So that won't happen in this case, but for shelters who don't use the locking feature, it is very possible to overwrite, and you'll want to be very cognizant of where this little blue arrow is pointing and which entry is bolded. So I'm going to go to create a new case note. So you'll see now that all of these fields are accessible. They can be updated, and we can go through this case note together, review some common definitions, and then we'll save it. So the type of program, this question is a standard question, and all standard questions will be indicated with what we call a form action, so essentially just an alert or a business rule to flag a question's importance for you. And this is just a measure that we've implemented as a network to support data quality and prevent errors, and save people time in terms of cleanup by ensuring that everyone kind of sees very clearly what is important when they're entering data. So in the case notes form, we don't have a lot. We have a lot of shared questions, but these questions aren't necessarily standard in the sense that we request that people fill them out, that everyone fills them out. So your case note form is going to probably look very different, but we'll do our best to address those common questions that we've encountered on the case note form itself. And Christoph, once I've gone through this, I'm sure you'll have a lot to contribute because I know you work on case notes quite a bit with shelters. So the type of program, as I mentioned, we have 2 residential program options, one for emergency and one for second stage. So if you're completing a case note for an emergency shelter, then you'll want to select emergency. For second stage. And then for the outreach follow-up, typically shelters do have outreach staff that kind of work out of different shelters. So some of you may have both an emergency and a second stage, and then you may have outreach staff that work at each site, or but the use of the emergency versus second stage outreach follow-up isn't as obvious as the residential drop-down options are. So I would say if there's any need for clarity, that talking to your outcome tracker administrator is a great starting point to clarify that. So I'm going to select emergency residential here. I may also have a program name for this activity. So, in this case, maybe I'll just choose residential, but you may, within your shelter offer different programs that you want to capture as well. So you may have a staff person that's offering a group program within shelter, and in that case you may have all of your group names listed here under program name, so you could select the appropriate question there as well. But this program name option is like a custom shelter specific field, so it'll look different for everybody. And we do ask that the note author is indicated, and this supports we have reports in Outcome Tracker. Like some shelters are required to report on kind of the service hours they spend. Like they report on their FTE. And so filling out this note author would allow you to go into the report section of Outcome Tracker and then pull all the case notes that you've done over, the month or the year, and then add up the hours that you spent providing different services. So that's the importance of the note author question. Sometimes the note author isn't necessarily the person entering the note, so there's the second name option here to reflect who did the data entry, and that's always helpful if there's a need to follow up, if there's an error on the case note or that type of thing, to follow up with the person who actually did the data entry may be helpful. There's the date of the note that we would like to track. So if I'm completing a case note on June 7th, as is indicated here, these date questions will default to the day that the data entry is happening, but if I am a week behind on my case notes, which never happens, I'm sure, just kidding, I'm sure it happens all the time, then I'd like to backdate this date of note to reflect the date that I completed the activity that I'm documenting in the case note. So this is intended to reflect not the data entry date, but the date that the note is intended to represent, I guess, in terms of when a woman was met with and that type of thing. So you can either enter them in the month, day, year format manually, or you can use, there's a calendar option next to the data entry field that you can scroll through, either by month or using the drop-down lists to access the year and the month. You can also default to today's date if you'd like, or as I mentioned, work backwards. So I'm going to pretend that this activity that I'm documenting actually took place on June 1st. So some shelters will document the time of the note. They might document, and this is particularly relevant for outreach staff, how much time was spent traveling versus how much time was spent actually in contact with a client or a woman or child. So you may document here, and it's important to note that this question is asking for minutes, and so is this question. There are other cases where you may be asked for hours, so it's important to note that, yeah, if you were to put 1.5 in here, that wouldn't look like an hour and a half, that would look like a minute and a half. So just another flag. The type of note is typically answered across all shelters. So we have either direct contact or indirect contact or indirect work on a client's behalf. So shelters may track any referral work or documentation that they're supporting women with that doesn't necessarily require face-to-face contact, but is work nonetheless in support of that woman. And there is another option here as well. So with direct contact, you'll notice we have the type of note, we've indicated direct contact, and then there's an accompanying question called the detail question. And this list here will update depending on what option is selected from the type of note. So if I choose indirect work with contact, I'm going to see a different set of options to choose from. So it could be case conferencing in this case, whereas if I choose direct contact here, I'm going to see options like advocacy, intake and screening, support, provision of basic needs, discharge, etc. Okay, so another standard question with standard response choices is the type of service provided in the course of contact. So typically there may be a primary reason such as advocacy or an intake that happens that gets documented in the type of note. So the primary reason for a contact with a woman will be documented in that type of note, but a number of other things happen. It would be, I think, very atypical for just one thing to happen in an hour and a half or 3 hours of support that's provided. So we use the type of services provided in the course of contact to document kind of, okay, well, I did an intake, but there were a number of basic needs, concerns that had to be addressed. We had to get food, maybe some clothing or first aid or anything like that. So these things would be reflected in the types of services as well. So there may have been some initial safety planning done. Transportation may have been part of the service to help a woman entering shelter get to the shelter. So many things can be reflected in this list. And this is what we call a multi-select list. So where we have a drop down here with the option to select just one option. In this list, we can select one and we can click on the control key on our keyboard and then select as many options as we need to, as many as are relevant to this contact. Okay, so just a few more. So the type of contact can be in person, by phone, or no contact if it's indirect. And some shelters are tracking the results of the contact. So whether an attempt to contact was made but not successful, or whether it was made and successful. I'm not going to dive in too much to that because I think that's, again, very very subject to what happens at your shelter and what's part of your standard practice. These questions here, and I apologize, the order seems to, some formatting has made this a little bit wonky, but something that has become more standard practice, I would say a number of shelters are tracking this, is promising practices in the area of domestic violence suggest that safety planning is happening informally all the time. And we don't want that to be lost, that, you know, there is formal safety planning, you know, that's very structured, but there's a lot of checking in, a lot of updates around safety that happen every time staff touch base with women in shelters or in outreach programs. And so the more formal options are reflected here in developing a safety plan, so sitting down, reviewing all the concerns and, you know, putting together some actions and strategies, and then there's changes to an existing safety plan. And these are a number of safety planning tools that we recognize happen on an ongoing basis. So, you know, discussing safety technology, accompaniment to court, arranging transportation, doing safety checks, updating abuser information as needed. So yes, these are, again, it's a multi-select, so as many as are relevant can be selected, and you may be doing this every time you meet with someone. And that is totally expected and appreciated that you document. And these questions, again, are questions that have been standardized across ACWS. And we're finally down here to where you would write your case note. And this is the narrative just describing your contact. There is many ways to complete a case note, and your shelter likely has a practice around entering case notes. But I will just note that ACWS has done some training, some ethics training on case notes, and there are resources available if you're interested and want to follow up. We did some training back in the fall that was very well received with Dawn McBride around some promising practices in documenting services for women in their case notes. So, yeah. So you may require that case notes are reviewed by a supervisor, and in that case, you can indicate the date that happened. You can select the name of the supervisor from the list here. Let's put Jan. And then lastly, you can connect this case note to an admission. So this list here, this question is called the enrollment link. So the enrollment link allows us to build a relationship between, you know, a data entry activity and another data entry activity that, you know, that contain information that we would like to analyze together ultimately. So a good example of why this question is necessary is that you may have a woman who is in shelter and outreach concurrently. So a lot of shelters provide outreach services. So maybe your outreach worker is a court support worker, and their function is to accompany women in shelter to court. In those cases, you probably want to distinguish between case notes that are for their shelter and then their shelter services, and then case notes that are for their outreach services. And there also might be different details about them that are tracked on the outreach form versus the shelter form. And that can be really, really helpful to link that information to, you know, the specific services that women need, or, you know, the specific interventions that are used with women. So we ask that you use this enrollment link question to connect to the intake form that it's associated with. And I hope that's clear. That one's always a bit tough to explain, so if I can clarify it all, please let me know. And then we're at the bottom of the form. So you have at the bottom of the form and the top of the form the option to save. And if we save this form, it is saved, but it can still be edited. So I can, update things. So a lot of shelters would, so I'm the crisis worker. I complete my case note and I save it, and then Jan comes along, reviews it, attaches her name to it, she makes sure everything is correct, and then it would be Jan's role to save and lock this form. And then once it's locked, it can't be edited, it can't be deleted in any way. It's sort of securely documented, so I can still read it and review it, but I can't make changes to it. So that's, again, I refer to that option. That would be, one workflow that the save and lock feature work well for. If you save and lock a form and then you identify an error on it, you do have to contact your OT administrator. So they will have to unlock the form on your behalf. It can't be unlocked typically by basic users. Okay, so I'm going to pause again and just check in with you, Christoph.
We do have a question
Cool.
From Helen, who asks, if I travel to see a client, do I note that in the drop-down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I will cautiously say yes. I don't know, again, because these activities may vary in your shelter site, but if we go to a new form, if I create a new case note that I can edit, I'll show you that. So if there's both direct contact and travel that you want to capture kind of on one case note, you can, first of all, document, so I spent 90 minutes with a woman. I spent 20 minutes on either end traveling to see her, so that's 40 minutes in total. And then I had direct contact. But I can also, I think, document down here in the services, so maybe you gave her a ride somewhere, so she was part of that travel. You can document transportation and that type of thing. But you do document travel in the case note itself if you want to. Does that answer your question, Helen?
We have another question from Nikki, who asks, where are the records kept, the cloud and or the organization's network?
Yeah, so VistaShare has a number of servers that are cloud-based now. So they, I believe Amazon's their provider. But in that transition, they did check in around whether our safety needs and our privacy needs were sustained through that transition. So everything that we need in terms of privacy has been maintained. And the nice thing about that is Outcome Tracker, so it can be accessed remotely. It's through a website that way. So if you were needing to access the records offsite, they're stored in a cloud and can be accessed just through the VistaShare login page from any computer.
So Helen clarifies that the client would not be traveling. Mm-hmm. So Helen, in that case, you would note your travel in travel duration. And if there is no travel, then we would assume that there's no traveling involved. And if there is a number in that travel duration, then we would assume that there's traveling involved to provide the service for that person.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I would say. So Helen, unless you're providing transportation to the client to an appointment or something like that, then you would not mark transportation and the type of service provided. You would put the travel time in the box here, and like I said, if there's nothing in the box, then we would assume that there's no travel time involved.
Yeah, exactly.
Ali asks, we accept any gender. Are we only entering women and children?
No. So that's, again, I train to kind of what is like commonly practiced for shelters, but yeah, there is, I think, anyone who's defined as a client by your program can be entered and documented in Outcome Tracker. There's no rules around who goes in. From our perspective, it's just that the common populations that shelters are serving in what's considered our shared data set are women and their children.
I think those are all the questions.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm just going to point out a few other tabs that contain activities that, within the scenario of a staff person, so a crisis worker who doesn't necessarily do exhaustive data entry, but does pieces of data entry to document their work, might find handy. So we have the activity list here. So every client record has an activity list. Just leave this page. This activity list is a summary of all of the forms that have been filled out for this person. So as you can see, I have done a lot of testing with Betty Boop. And so I can review everything that's been completed for her right in one place. I can organize this information alphabetically if I like. So now I have the acuity scale at the top, calls, contacts, case notes here. I could sort it in order that the order it was completed. Likely I want to review the most recent first, so I know that her last activity was a goal attainment form. I can sort it by who the provider was. So remember on the case note we were documenting the person that was filling out the case note. Not necessarily the data entry person, but the person responsible for the case note. So we can sort there as well. So this is, one handy way to review what's happened with a client over the duration of her services. It's also where we go to enroll her in an activity. So some activities have forms that go with them. So the intake form and the discharge form is a great example. The case note has a form, so it shows up in this list, but it has its own form and doesn't need to be completed through the activity. But something like the Parenting Stress Index, which is something that a number of shelters use, doesn't have a data entry form. It's what we call an activity. So it's just a really basic pop-up that will allow you, so if I click on Enroll in Activity at the bottom, will allow you to pull up, which one did I just say? PSI? To search in the description box here. So I've searched for the PSI. Click on an activity and then enter it. And just update and close. So it won't show up on a tab anywhere, but it will be linked to a woman and can be reviewed under the activity list. So I can select whether I'm doing a pre or a post in this case. I can again connect it to that type of program that we use. So let's say the emergency residential, indicate the date, the provider. Choose Ali here. Some people track the hours spent on that activity. It's not necessary for our purposes, but it might be necessary for your shelter's purposes. And then I would add my scores. I don't know how the PSI is scored, so this could be very wrong, but And then something I'll point out is anytime you see a little green or blue question mark or a circle with a question mark in it, if you hover over it, it can provide a little bit more information about what information is being sought for that question. So in this case, I have a bit of a definition provided to me for the total stress raw score. So it's indicating you should add up the parental distress, parent-child dysfunction, raw and difficult child raw scores in order to get your total score. And then I'll just point out again at the enrollment link, I'll point out again the enrollment link question at the bottom of the page, because we do, again, find that this information is very helpful to analyze alongside information we learn about women when they come into shelter. So if women are experiencing, a high degree of financial distress, that may have implications for the level of parenting stress they're experiencing. Or if they indicate themselves that they are needing support with mental health, that could be something that would be helpful to understand alongside a woman's experience with parenting and stress. So yeah, so again, I'm just highlighting this enrollment link is a very valuable step to take in your data entry, and please be mindful to use it as much as you can to help us on the research and project side of things. Yeah. So that's the activity list. Should I go through another example? If anyone would like me to, I'm happy to. Otherwise, I might quickly pop over to the danger assessment tab. The danger assessment is an activity that we have designed a form for, and it's used very frequently across the network. So I think it's valuable for frontline staff who didn't get a chance to attend the training we did a couple of weeks ago on the data entry flow for that tool to review it now. But I don't want to leave here until I'm sure that it's okay to carry on.
So it looks like Nikki has raised her hand, but Nikki, what I would like you to do is in the questions pane of the, oh, sorry, we do have a question. Helen wants to know if we're going to have a break soon.
Yes, I was thinking that we would break at about 10:15, Helen, kind of once we were through this basic stuff. Like the scenario of just that might apply to crisis support. So I was thinking, yeah, like latest 20 after 10. Does that suit?
Okay, Helen says thanks. And yeah, Nikki had her hand raised, but I'm not sure if we answered her question yet. But if Nikki has a question, they can just put it in the questions pane and we'll talk about it. But one thing I do want to talk before we navigate away from this is that there is actually another option to enroll an activity for your client. You'll see in the CAT screen here on the upper right-hand corner, there's a enroll activity under tasks.
Yes.
And it's the same thing. It's just that if you don't want to bother going to the activity list and then enroll an activity, you can sort of skip a step, make things a little bit easier. But also, I want to just throw a word of warning out there that there are some activities that have a lot of form actions in the forms that are on the tabs. And if you try to enroll the client in the activity through this, you miss all the form actions. And we'll get very different results from what you would normally get from filling out the activity on the tab. A good example of that would be the danger assessment. I would advise you that if you're going to do a danger assessment for your client, you would always do it on the tab in the form, because the form has a lot of actions around calculating particular scores for you automatically. Yeah, so there's just some things that you will, at the intake too, probably things that you will almost certainly want to fill out on the tab with the form rather than enrolling an activity in that way.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the point, Christoph, of just checking the record. So once you're in Betty Boop's file and you're going to complete a piece of data entry, have a look if you're not familiar already with whether or not a tab exists for that activity, because it's ultimately easier for you to use the tab. If there's a tab there, it's for a reason, and it's typically to make data entry easier, easier for the people entering it. So. Did that question come through, or should I just roll on?
I think maybe it was from earlier, and we already answered that question. So let's move along.
Awesome. So again, forgive, there's like a zillion tabs here. I'm just gonna, I think it's right at the end. I'll just go right to the end. Here we go. So this is our brand new shiny danger assessment. So for those of you who have not done danger assessment training and are interested, ACWS provides training, both basic and train the trainer training. So we are a certified trainer of this tool. There aren't many of them. And essentially what the danger assessment does is it helps staff have a conversation with women about the abuse and violence they're experiencing, and then have an informed conversation about what the risks are to them based on patterns of behaviors that are happening in their abusive relationships. So we have a number of versions of the tool. Again, we document the type of program and the date that the tool is completed for, the staff person who's completing it. Something that accompanies the danger assessment is what's called the danger assessment calendar, and that is a reflection tool, so a review of a period of time a period of time in a woman's relationship, and trying to document instances of abuse, I think, to inform the actual assessment to follow. So if anyone knows the DA and thinks that I have not described that clearly, do let me know. That is my understanding of the tool. So not everyone, the DA calendar is very time intensive, and not all shelters have the capacity or resources to complete the DA calendar. So we have provided the option to either select no, I did not complete a calendar, or yes, I did complete a calendar. So if you do complete the calendar, it may be a different staff person who has done that piece of work. But essentially we're documenting the number of months where abuse was recorded, or the number of seasons in the case of the seasonal calendar. So there's 3 versions of the danger assessment tool. That there's the original version that was originally developed. There is a version that works with immigrant women and looks at some risk factors that are unique to newcomers. And there is the same-sex partners version that looks at risk factors that are unique to same-sex partnerships. And those versions...
Kat, there's also the Aboriginal.
I'm getting there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, so those 3 versions typically use the calendar that tracks the number of months where abuse was recorded. We also have the Walking the Path Together danger assessment, which was developed to support work with Indigenous women, that uses a seasonal calendar to document instances of abuse. So your shelter likely already has protocols in place for when to use the different versions of the tool. If you have any follow-up questions as an agency about the DA, we are happy to direct you to our training program developer to learn more. But essentially, yeah, we'll document different types of different instances of abuse, and they're all coded here and will be reflected on the paper tools that you use. And then from there, you select the danger assessment type that you're working with. So we have the DA, which is the original DA. And as you complete the questions here, so they're all yes/no questions. As Christoph mentioned, Different options have different scoring associated with them, and what we've done is we've automated the scoring to support accuracy and to also provide some feedback on the risk level that's being indicated through the responses as you're entering them. So different questions, like I mentioned, there are different risk factors that have been identified for different populations that shelters work with. So you'll notice if you choose the DAI, there are different questions that will appear in this list to capture accurately the risks that might present to some women who are new to Canada versus women in same-sex partnerships, that type of thing. So that's referring back to the example that Christoph mentioned. If we were to try to complete a DA through the activity list that we were just in, none of this automation would happen, and you would essentially run the risk of, well, you would have to manually enter your total score, and you could make a mistake because the scoring for the DA is a bit of it's quite onerous. Like a lot of the questions are weighted differently, and it's not a ton of fun to score manually. So yeah, and then just one potential data entry error. You'll notice that like when I partially completed this, and then I went back to the danger assessment type and I changed it. If you find yourself partway through a DA and you realize you've selected the wrong DA type from this list, it is very important that you clear any responses you've entered before you go back and change this response choice, because just because the questions don't appear on the form doesn't mean that that data isn't stored somewhere and will appear in a report incorrectly. So it's good practice if you're changing anything higher up on a form that you sort of work your way backwards through what you've completed already before making a change kind of further upstream on the form itself. Okay, so that's the DA. We are at 17 minutes past, so I said we'd break it around 10:20, so I'll just check in around questions, and if not, suggest that we break until 10:30. And then
there are no questions.
Okay.
But one thing I do want to add is that the changing responses thing, that's applicable to a lot of forms, not just danger assessment.
Yeah, we'll revisit that
yeah.
on all the forms that we go through
yeah.
when we add a new client, just to ensure that that is haunting you when you go.
Cool.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. And like I said, if you won't be doing data entry work beyond what we've covered, and you would like to excuse yourself from the rest of the training, by all means, we're going to follow up with everybody who attended or registered in the next couple of weeks, just to see how your early days of data entry are going. So just want to let you know that before you kind of step out of the training. But thanks for attending. And everyone else, we will reconvene at 10:30 and cover kind of the adding of a new client to the database, and then that complete workflow that we typically see with women from the point of calling the shelter to seek services all the way through to discharge and some other activities that might be documented for them. And then I'll do a brief run of where to access some basic reports if you feel you need to. So as I mentioned, kind of from here on out, I think we're going to go through sort of another common scenario, which is that that full journey that many women take from phoning the shelter to entering a program to possibly being referred to another program, to being discharged from the shelter and or other programming that your organization provides. So again, this will focus on the workflow and then a few data entry considerations to avoid errors. I'll highlight a few of the questions that are part of the ACWS shared data set, and I didn't talk about that too in depth earlier on, but I think it's important to understand that the reason why ACWS provides this training and why shelters share a database is because the shelters have agreed that there are certain parts of the services they provide that they would like to understand in a standard way and speak to collectively when they report on their services, when they advocate to government, and when they make decisions about program development. So those are the questions that have been highlighted typically in the manual in the notes and definitions section, and those are the questions that I will pay particular attention to as we review that other standard workflow that we often see. So you may not all be responsible for every part of this data entry, but hopefully we move through it quick enough that the pieces that are relevant to you, you don't have to wait too long to hear them. So we're going to return to people organizations. I'll just abandon this form here. So we're back in the filing cabinet, getting ready to search and then ultimately add a new person to the database. So we do recommend, before you go straight to the task, which is displayed over on the right here, there are task features under the People Organization tab that allow you to add a new person or add a new organization. But before you do that, even if you're fairly certain that someone's not in your system, it is a good practice to search and just make sure. Again, partly because of the I think pretty common scenario I mentioned, that often when women are calling, it's either not appropriate or not possible to verify the spelling of their name. And so someone could be in the shelter or in your database, having already called the shelter before you go to add them to the system. And a lot of women or individuals, if your shelter runs at a very high capacity, may be phoning multiple times. And so that person may seem new to you, but they could have spoken to another person at your shelter, you know, the day before looking for space. So yeah, so we're going to add Joan Jett to the database, but we're just going to have a look here first to see if she's in the database. And maybe I'll try spelling Joan with a G. That doesn't really make sense, but you know, it could. So we're not getting any response choice, or yeah, no names are popping up. So it's looking very likely that she's not in here. I'm just going to verify again that all of these filters that are available to me to limit my search are set to be as open as possible. And they all are set to all. So I'm feeling fairly confident that this person is already in the database and I can go ahead and add a new person. So that's what I'm going to do. So Joan has just phoned the shelter today requesting space. There are two role options. They're used in the same way, but just some shelters preferred caller, some shelters preferred potential client, some shelters document, use the potential client role for only admission requests, and then some shelters don't. So there's a lot of flexibility between those two roles, but one of those two roles is the standard role that you would use to document a call to your shelter for shelter-related programming. A small caveat for those of you who are working at very large organizations, you may have, you may offer programming that's not shelter-related, and in those cases you might have other roles. So if you're not sure and you work in one of those shelters, I would talk to your database administrator just to confirm what role you should be using. But typically if you work in a shelter and you're taking a call, you will use either caller or potential client. So in this case, I'm going to choose potential client. And the first tab that appears is the Edit tab, and this is where they're called system fields. So these are details about a person that are, typically, I guess, more fixed. So like profile information. So that might be their email address. So I'm going to put in Joan Jett at acws.ca. So we need an email address for Joan. We may want to add other details here, address and that type of thing, but at the very least, we really want to enter an email address in for her. Oops. So we've done that. The next step, once we've created the record for Joan, is to address any details about the record we just created that might be affected by our data entry process. And what I mean specifically by that is that data entry very frequently doesn't happen on the same day that the data is collected directly from a person. So often shelters don't get a chance to enter their calls contacts the day they happen, and it may be a day or two behind schedule. And in that case, our next step before we do any data entry is to go to the roles tab. So I created that role when I added Joan, and that role got assigned a date. And like it does on other activities, this date defaults to the data entry date. But it's very important that if I'm a week behind, so let's say that Joan actually phoned on May 31st, that I go back and update this begin date to reflect the day that she actually entered the role of caller. And the reason for this is that this date is used to as a filter in a lot of reports that shelters rely on to submit stats about their calls to their funders. So if this date, if this call actually happened in May, but her role date is a June date, her call won't be reflected accurately in her May report, and it also may not be accurately reflected in her June report, because when you fill out the actual call form, you might enter in a May date. So what happens is this call contact will be missed altogether from your stats, and ultimately we don't want that. We want our reports to accurately reflect kind of that point in time information or that month-to-month information. And depending on the volume of calls your shelters get, it's really easy in the data cleanup process to miss these kinds of errors. So we ask that this is sort of that next step that you take once you've added somebody to the database. Go back, check the roles, make sure the role dates are accurate. So our next step then is to go directly to the calls contacts form and just to document our conversation with Joan. So Joan was phoning, seeking access to the emergency shelter. So I'm going to select the emergency residential type of program from this list. You'll notice again, this question is bolded and red. And that's to alert you to a question that has an impact on the standard data set or you're reporting to your funders and participating in ACWS research. So it's highlighted for you. It's very important that it's completed accurately, and hopefully that supports you to complete it accurately. So the gender of the contact, in this case, is female. I may have a program name that I want to select as well. So I'll do that, but that again would be determined by what your shelter has done in defining the program name. I want to document the length of the call, and again, I'll just highlight it's focused on minutes. And we This is a question that's very relevant to ACWS advocacy. Shelters spend an incredible amount of time supporting crisis lines across Alberta, and we track that and we report that. So please do fill this out accurately. This was requested by a number of shelters wanting to know if this was the first time the person had contacted the shelter on a given day. Typically, a call contact, only one call contact is recorded. So our agreed upon process is that you only document one call in a 24-hour period. So some woman may phone multiple times in one day requesting admission to your shelter, but we only document it once within a 24-hour period. So I will put yes to this question. The type of request is the residential admission request, so she is seeking shelter space. The other options available to us are information requests, so they may be requesting information about other programs or services, or you know, just about options in general. So this could be just a general "I need help, please direct me" kind of call. It could be a crisis support call that doesn't result in a specific request, but shelters are often providing crisis support. It could be a call related to a client from a non-client caller, or it could be other altogether. And many shelters use the other option to document like fundraising calls or more operations-focused calls if they have a need to track that information. So we're going to focus on the residential admission request. I would say that this is the most, well, not most important, but it informs our collective work as a network the most. So this is where we track how many people are seeking space in a shelter versus how much shelter space is actually available. We have what we track consistently, which is the residential admission requests. Shelters may also track information requests, so those could just be general seeking of information or an understanding about programs or services. Crisis support could be a crisis call that doesn't necessarily result in a request for service, but is time spent obviously supporting someone nonetheless. And then client-related calls are calls documented about third parties that are relevant to clients who are in shelter. And then other is an option that staff use often to capture things like fundraising calls or operations calls that they need to track for other reasons, but that we're not really concerned with as a network. So the if admission request, so I've chosen residential admission request because we're going through that full flow, that workflow that we discussed of a woman's point of entry into shelter being a call and then an admission and that type of thing. But even though we're eventually going to admit Joan on this call, for the purposes of reviewing some definitions, I'm going to choose not admitted from this drop-down list. So when we choose not admitted, what we're trying to capture is a piece of information that's very relevant to our advocacy as a collective, which is we have a lot of people who need shelter services who can't access them because shelters either don't have the space or the capacity to do so. And so this is how we track and document that information. So if someone's requesting an admission and they're not admitted, we want to know why. So it could be due to capacity. It's often due to capacity. It could be that because of demand, shelters have established priority levels for admission to their programming, and some women might not meet those priority levels. It could be that in the cases where there's lateral violence happening in families, it could be that the shelter is already serving a woman who would be put at risk by the admission of another woman who may be one of her abusers or may compromise her safety in some way.
So I hate to interrupt you, Kat, but we have a question from Jan who says that she still can't hear. Are there other people who are still having problems hearing Kat or me. Kat's coming in clear for me, and people were able to hear me even when Kat's connection
Okay.
was.
Yeah,
So
thank
Jan,
you.
no problem. So Jan, if you're still having issues, yeah, people saying they can hear us both. Oh, Jan has seemed to have left. So maybe Jan is trying to reconnect. Okay. Okay, continue on. Sorry.
No worries. Thanks for checking.
Yeah.
Don't want to repeat that a third time. That would be
For
brutal.
sure.
And then program may not be able to accommodate clients' needs. So just examples, a woman may have very acute service needs in terms of trauma or mental health that maybe a program can't accommodate safely, or there's just a better program suited out there. Or there may be some physical environment needs. A lot of shelters are operating in very old facilities that may not be accessible. In that case, the program may not be able to accommodate a woman safely in the case of, a fire or an emergency in the building, that type of thing. And then there's another option, and whenever you select other, you have an opportunity to provide some detail to explain that other option. But typically, or very often, we're seeing unable to accommodate due to capacity. And then in that case, there's sort of another layer of detail, which is like it may be a very large family. So there may be beds available, but there's 6 children. And that family just can't be accommodated comfortably or safely in, the beds that are available. You could find yourself exceeding government approved capacity. So like many shelters will bring in cots or cribs to have families together in rooms that would normally have fewer beds. But like the overall head count is, still higher even if you've got empty rooms. And so shelters can't necessarily accommodate additional families in those cases. And then there's due to capacity other. So that's, again, always an option for you if those other 2 options don't seem to fit. So number of dependent children, I think it's important to emphasize that we are looking at the number of dependent children who are seeking admission with a woman. So a woman may have a number of children, maybe 2 of them are the age of majority, so they're over 18. They don't need to come to shelter. They are safe somewhere, so they don't need to be documented here. You would only document maybe her 15-year-old who would be coming to shelter with her or looking for space within the shelter. Many women don't have, oh man, this gets so complicated, so I'm just going to run through a bunch of scenarios, and I know you guys can appreciate how complicated this gets. Many women don't have custody of their children, so they may have a number of children. Those children may not be in their custody. Many women may find safe accommodation elsewhere for their children, so we don't want those kids documented here if they're safe somewhere else, unless the woman is asking for enough space that her children can join her later in the shelter. And that happens often too. A lot of women who are sorting out custody issues with their kids will request space for either their kids to visit them or for their kids to stay there. And in those cases, like if you are taking space for kids, we count them. But if we're not taking space or beds for kids, we don't count them. That, I suspect, will raise some questions. This one always does. So please feel free to fire away and we'll get to them very quickly here. And the last, I think this is the last major one that will probably also result in some questions is, was the caller provided a supported referral to another program offered by the shelter? So if we can't admit Joan to the shelter, can we provide her community-based services with one of our outreach staff? So shelters have gotten into the process of documenting this because we want to understand, okay, so it's not the same kind of turnaway if we can serve her somewhere else. Or maybe, you know, she is identified as someone who might do really well with community-based services. So, you know, we're going to provide that supported referral to another program that can meet her needs with the resources available. So we'll indicate yes in this case. Oh, I didn't put any kids in. Let's see. Let's do one, so I only have to add one. Okay. And then, you know, like you guys may track referrals made to callers. You may track types of services provided, additional accessibility questions, or you know, you may make a note here for your colleagues, and that's great. Those are not you know, questions that we're concerned with as a network. We can certainly do our best to support you in understanding those questions at your shelter, or helping, you know, develop definitions for those questions if needed. But at this point, we're not going to focus a lot of time on them. I'm going to go back up though, because ultimately we are going to admit Joan. And so I'm just going to remind everybody that because I'm going to change the response choice to this if admission request question, I'm going to start down here and work backwards through the questions I have answered, so that I'm not leaving any incorrect data on my form when I make this change. So I'm going to go admitted to the program here. And I'm going to select no, was not provided a supported referral because she was admitted to the program. And then I will click save. Okay, any questions, Christoph, before I carry on?
No questions.
Okay, cool. So now I've admitted Joan. So her call has been entered into the database. I have to go now and admit her to the program through a couple of steps so it's reflected in her record, and so that I have the data entry tabs I need to complete an intake form for her. So the place I'm going to go is back to the roles tab. So this is where I can edit an existing role that I've already created, and I can also add a new role. So in this case, because I'm admitting Joan to an emergency shelter, I am going to choose the residential adult role right here. And let's say her admission date was on June 5th. So I'll backdate that begin date again so it's accurately reflecting when she came to shelter and spent her first night at the shelter. Okay. So I just wanted to let you guys know, in the manual, we refer to all those standard roles, and they're indicated with like ACWS in the brackets. So if you guys do have a lot of roles in your shelter sites, not many do, but some do, just please know you can refer to the manual for those standard roles, and also watch out for that ACWS tag. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so now that I've selected that role, you'll see a few additional tabs have shown up for me here. So I now have a residential intake tab, a residential discharge, etc. So I'm going to go to that intake tab. And we'll just quickly, we're going to zoom through this and just review, again, those definitions. So again, program name will be your shelter program name. I'll put my name on here. I'm probably all the way down here at the bottom. Where am I? Oh, there I am. Type of program is correct. We have the emergency residential program. You'll notice here it's flagged a primary family member. So Joan, we indicated, had one child with her, so I am going to put primary family member. And then once we've gone through her intake form, we're going to go and we're going to admit her son, Jack. But we'll complete the data entry for her intake form first. Okay. So another question we ask that does result sometimes in confusion is the province. And so when we ask for the province information here, we are asking for the province where the woman's last place of residence was. So if she is fleeing an abusive relationship that happened in BC, but she is, had some temporary, like stayed a few days in Alberta as she's making her way to a shelter, ultimately we want to document that she's coming from BC, even if there was a brief stopover in Alberta. And this does get reported for those shelters who have provincial funding to the provincial funders. So we can select BC. In the case of Joan, though, actually she was from Alberta. And when Joan's from Alberta, we have a number of regions identified for Alberta in this list. So Southwestern, Southeast, Calgary and area, Central, etc. And we've included here a hyperlink to a map that will allow you to select the community in more detail. So let's say Airdrie, and search and get the region number. If you're not familiar with the region number that the woman, like if you're not familiar with the number assigned to the region the woman came from. So in this case, we'll put region 3. You'll be, capturing address, I'm sure, and phone number. Safety concerns is frequently documented here, and that's sort of an important, I think, launch point for a lot of services. The admission date, again, reflects the first day in shelter. So sometimes a woman will be admitted ahead of her actual stay, but the day that she's admitted is the day that she starts taking up space, physical space in your shelter. So I think we said June 5th. We have family composition, so the option is a single client. Single client referring to a woman being admitted alone, not a single woman. That could have different, it could be interpreted differently, but this is just like a one person coming to shelter versus a family. Some shelters do track non-admitted dependents. Many women receive supports for children who don't come to shelter. That's very worthwhile to document. We have the referral source. So she may have been referred by another community agency. And then birth date is, we track ages for individuals. So let's put, May 27th, she is female. We, rather than asking cultural background or ethnicity or questions about like identification that way, we have a series of 4 questions that capture details about identity that have been linked to risk factors for violence or for the need for additional shelter supports and services. And this is how we have agreed with the province to report on this background information. So we have a question about self-identification as Aboriginal, and yes or no, and choosing not to answer is always an option. In this case, we'll choose no. If the client does not identify as Aboriginal, we do want to know whether that individual was born in Canada. In this case, we will say no. If the client was not born in Canada, what is their length of time spent in Canada or living in Canada? So we can say between 2 and 3 years. But I'll just show you if we were to do this differently. So if we were to choose, here, let me do the right thing and work backwards here. I'll clear all this out. If we were to choose yes, the client does self-identify as Aboriginal, then there's a detailed question asked, and also whether or not that individual would normally reside on reserve. If woman says no, and the client was born in Canada, that's sort of the end of the thread there. So I'll leave that at that. If anyone wants to revisit some of those definitions, we can certainly look at them. We can come back to them. So we're going to do client does not self-identify as Aboriginal, and we will say the client was not born in Canada and has been in Canada for between 2 and 3 years. Some groups ask other, like some shelters ask other, the question about background in different ways, and so these questions have been left on here, so you may see other options on your shelter site as well, but the ones highlighted in red are sort of the standard across the network questions that we do ask about background. There are a number of demographic questions and what we call stability factor questions about employment status, level of education, sources of income, again, that also provide us with a bit of information about the services that might be needed to support a woman and her family. Some legal questions. Many women coming to shelter require legal supports. Some other housing questions. And then, has the client stayed in the shelter in the past? This is an ACWS requested field. If she has, we are trying to understand how frequently a woman will be readmitted to shelter after returning to a relationship. So we'll say yes. And then, if a woman did return to a relationship, we collectively have an interest in understanding why. So whether other housing wasn't available, she did so in the interests of her family, there was still hope for the relationship, etc. So there's a number of options to choose from there as well. And then another multi-select option is the type of abuse experience leading up to the admission. So the abuse that's relevant to this admission, or the relationship that preceded this admission. We have other types of abuse, so before this admission and in adulthood, and then also abuse experienced or witnessed as a child and those types as well. So not all shelters collect all of those. Your shelter may collect information about injuries, exposure to violence and abuse, interactions with police, but these are all, again, voluntary questions. The section on health is being collected, I would say, more frequently in terms of understanding physical health needs, mental health needs, some of the needs of children being admitted with women, and then also any concerns with addictions or risk of suicide. These are all things that many shelters track but are not standardized across the network. So I will pass through these fairly quickly and then point out at the bottom the last of the sort of standard fields, which is again that enrollment link field. And this particular enrollment link links back to the call contact that resulted in the admission. So, you know, if Joan Jett had phoned 10 times over a 2-week period, you would have a long list here to review, and you would select the one that ultimately resulted in her being admitted to the shelter. And that's that. So we're going to click save. And now our form has been saved. Okay, have any questions come up, Christoph?
No questions, but I would like to make a few observations. One is I just want to make sure that the attendees know that their residential intake form will likely look a little bit different from ours because we are sort of the parent agency for all of the members. We have pretty much every possible question in the in the intake form on our form. And there are a lot, as Kat was saying, there are a lot of questions that are optional. And if your shelter doesn't collect those questions, they will likely not be on your form. So your intake form is likely to be much shorter than ours. So this is something to keep in mind. And also, just because it is on your intake form doesn't necessarily mean that your shelter is collecting that information. You might want to talk to your administrator just to make sure you have a clear understanding of what exactly your shelter is collecting on the intake form. And another thing that I wanted to point out was that Kat had mentioned that you will likely be backdating some of your entries. You know, you sometimes get a little bit behind and don't get to put in your data entry until a few days after it's happened. But another thing that's also true is that you can also predate your data entry. So like, I think the intake is a good example of that. If you know that your client is going to be admitted into shelter in a few days, you can enter that in before that day. If you're pretty confident that that's going to happen, it can save you a little bit of time. You can just put the date in a few days before. So for instance, if I knew that on the 10th someone was going to be admitted, I could fill that out today and save myself a little bit of time on the 10th. And another thing I wanted to ask Kat, is there any place that we can record Joan Jett's attitudes vis-a-vis rock and roll?
I was muted, but I laughed.
Good, I was glad. There was a bit of silence there. Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to point out those few things, and yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so next step, we've admitted Joan. You'll remember that she is a primary family member and she has one child seeking admission with her. So we're going to go back to the People Organizations tab. And we're going to search for Jack Jett. And I don't feel very creative about other ways to spell Jack. I don't think there is another way to spell Jack. So I'm going to go ahead and add Jack here. And just as there's the residential adult role, there's also a residential child role that'll be right below it. It's standard and it's important that children are assigned the child role. So Jack probably doesn't have an email address. He's very young. So we're going to go straight to that roles tab and update Jack's role as well. So I'll point out here, sometimes kids don't come in on the same day as their mom. So just enter the role dates and the admission dates that reflect when the children came to shelter. So they may not match up and that's okay. But I'll keep it simple. And add, oh, that's not the same day. Sorry. Here we go. So the role is updated, step 1 complete, and now we have the residential child intake. Oh, actually, before I do that, scratch that. We're going to go to relationships here. We're going to add a relationship. So we need to connect Jack and Joan together. And that's also for reporting purposes because they have a shared experience in shelter that we want to be able to speak to. So the relationship that is used most frequently in shelters and is standard is the primary family member and family member relationship. So whose record you're in is the relationship you select from this list. So because I'm in Jack's record, and Jack is the child of Joan, he is the family member of Joan, who's the primary family member. So I select family member. And then in this search field here, I can start typing in Joan's name. And it will automatically populate with names that are in your database, and you can just select the name, and now that relationship is established. And you'll remember me pointing out that once the relationship is designed, you can flow easily back and forth between their files. So if you're entering case notes that apply to both Joan and Jack, you can use this tab to flow through their files really quickly. So now the relationship's established. We don't have to worry about any dates for this relationship. It can just be left open. And we're going to go back to the intake form and complete an intake form for Jack as well. So we'll select the emergency residential type of program. Select my name here as the data entry person. Again, many fields here that you will not see on your forms. So I'm just going to flow down to where we start getting to the questions that are really pertinent to, that will be on your forms and then are relevant to what we're doing as a network. So we have our admission date. We can indicate here whether the child was admitted at the same time as the parent, later, or earlier. I don't think earlier happens very often. A birth date, so we'll do, that's 2 years old, I think. And then none of these fields are required. What's actually required for children is very minimal, but shelters who are focusing more on children's services will collect a lot of information. And so I'll leave it to you to connect with your OT administrator to clarify questions. So that might be it on the intake form. It is. Yeah, so we just need an age. I think there must be gender. And it appears our form action is broken. Yeah, it's here. So our form action doesn't seem to be working, but in your sites, this field should appear in the same way that these fields do. Bold and red and alerty. Okay, so that intake is complete. So I'm going to, I think, review very quickly. Like, we've reviewed case notes, we've looked at the activity list, we've looked at relationships, and so I'm going to find, I think I passed it. There it is. We'll go through and we'll discharge Jack, and then we'll go back to the relationships tab, link to Joan's file, review her discharge form, and then talk about what it looks like when she comes back to shelter, either in an outreach program or in shelter again. And yeah, talk about the multiple admissions issues that we sometimes encounter and some ways, some steps you can take to prevent those issues. So again, all that's required is the discharge date. So we'll say that they stayed about a week. Types of services. So this is a multi-select. It's the same question you see on case notes form for the same options. And then some of these services have details that shelters want to collect about those services. So a secondary list may show up for you that you can choose from as well. Any referrals you've made for those children, and again, any details about those referrals that you want to collect. And that's that. So those are the basics that we collect as a network, and you likely report on that have to be accurate. And all of these services and referrals, there are accompanying definitions in the manual, as I mentioned. So we've done our best to elaborate if there's still, if it's still not clear, because it's always very complicated and very contextual community to community. You can reach out to us and we can help clarify. We'll reach out to your OT administrator who will reach out to us and we can clarify to the best of our abilities. Okay, So now it's time to discharge Joan. So we're going to go back to that relationships tab, click on her name, and then find her discharge form as well. Okay, so for Joan, we want the discharge date, obviously, as well. We would like to know the reason for discharge. So there's two sort of leading categories. One is chose to leave or was asked to leave. If a woman chose to leave, these are the drop-down options we're interested in. So she completed the program and met her goals. Another program was found to be better suited to her and her family, or she did not complete the program or meet her goals. And I think that there is some detail to that response choice. So if she did not meet the program and meet her goals, then there are some options to choose from. So found safe accommodation, the communal living environment did not meet the needs, client indicated a choice to discontinue, client left without providing a reason. So I won't go into much detail there, but if there are questions, please do ask them and we can touch on them. But I'll just, again, work backwards here, clear my responses, and look at what our options are when asked to leave. So again, we're looking for reasons when a woman was asked to leave. So it could be that the shelter is not able to extend her stay. Needs were identified that the shelter could not accommodate, or the client was unable to meet shelter policy requirements, or other. So that other is always there as well. So let's choose unable to extend program stay. And again, just as we did on Jack's form, we want to document referrals and services. These are multi-selects, and you can select as many as you'd like. Do that, and then we get to living arrangements after discharge. So we have with family or with a friend or friends, with family, returning to abuser, with a new partner, on own, with or without children, and undecided or unsure, as well as other. So let's choose on own. And I believe that is it. So we'll hit save. And that's complete. So we've gone through admitting and discharging a family from Outcome Tracker. Are there any questions?
No questions.
Okay, cool. So we are going to go back to people organizations, and we're going to pretend that Joan, when she left shelter, she decided to come back a few days later. So we're going to search for her. This time, for the sake of time, we're going to pretend that just Joan is coming back and Jack's not coming with her this time. So we'll just admit Joan. The process would be the same in many ways if both family members were coming back, but in this case we'll just readmit Joan. So Joan, we open up her file, and we're automatically brought back to, just so you know, the last place we were in her file. That's kind of how Outcome Tracker works. So we land on the discharge form. What we actually want to do is document the call. So she's going to call again. And when we go back to the Calls Contacts tab, you'll see that it's taking us back to the form that we've already completed. So we have two options here to create a new call contact. We can click on the new calls contacts, and what that will do is create a new blank form for us to work from. So if I click here, you'll see that the bolded option that I'm pointing to with the arrow is totally blank. There's no detail about when it happened or what type of request it was. So I can do it that way and then just fill everything out from scratch. Or to save myself a bit of time, I can go to the last call. And if I know not a lot of information has changed since her previous call, I can use this copy function. So if I click on copy, I'm asked to select the person to copy this form to. Select self if you simply want to create a current copy of this form. So if I just want to create a new copy for Joan in her own record, I'm going to choose self, Joan Jett. And then I can see here, sorry, my GoToWebinar pop-up is always in the way, it seems. I can see here that I have 2 identical calls contacts. I'm in one of them, and all I have to do is go through and highlight and edit. So the date of the referral call contact, so it's actually going to be today's date, so I would update this for sure. Maybe this call was only 20 minutes because I already know Joan. You know, maybe it's a different kind of request this time. Maybe this time she was provided a supported referral to outreach. The number of dependent children will have to change because we're not admitting our kids. Is that on this form, Christoph? I'm sure it was. Maybe not. Anyway, we'll click Save. So I've documented my call. They're all there now. And we'll just ignore this one. So technically I've created an enrollment that is just going to be left blank there, and I just did that to show you that you could click on New. You'd want to get rid of that and contact your OT administrator to get rid of that if you don't want it there. So now we're going to readmit her to the program. So once again, I have the option to copy, and because this is a really recent admission, it may make sense, like maybe not a lot of information has changed, so I can choose copy. I can copy to Joan's file. And just change the information that I know I need to update. So for instance, the admission date, we'll make it the 7th. And you'll notice one downside to copying is that some of these fields are no longer bolded and highlighted. So you do have to use quite a bit of care when you copy, just to make sure you update all the information you need to update. This time she's being admitted as a single client, so I need to update that, et cetera, but her other details have likely not changed, and so I'm going to just blow through here. I'm going to change this. And click the new enrollment link that I need to link to, which will be, oh, they both have the same call date. So I will choose this one at the top for argument's sake. Normally they would have a different call date and you would refer to that call date in your selection.
So we have a question from Helen, who is hoping that you can show how to duplicate a calls contact again.
Sure. Definitely. So we'll go back to the calls contacts tab. So what you do is in your list on the right, you'll refer to the call that you want to copy, and it'll be indicated by, so there's a blue arrow and then that call is sort of bolded for you. And so it lets you know that's the version of the form that you have open. So once it's selected, you can click on copy. And then, can I make this bigger? Yeah, okay, great. And then you have the option to copy the form to self, and it'll give you the name of the record in person. You can technically copy to other, like to people in relationships, but we don't really recommend you do that, so I'm not showing you how to do that. And then you just click OK. And then you've created a copy of the call, and you just have to go through the form and diligently update. So say this time, Joan is actually phoning about outreach. I would have to update the type of program. And any other questions, that are different on this form, and, go through everything, update the dates, update the length of call. But if you have a bunch of other information that's being tracked, that doesn't change, then you sort of save yourself quite a bit of data entry work by using this method. We'll just click Save.
So Helen first is laughing at my goof, which is quite good. I'm glad somebody got a laugh at it. But, also wants to know if you can duplicate a calls contact to a case notes.
Yeah. Oh, you can't. So you can't duplicate the call onto a case note, but you can copy case notes as well. Is that what she's asking?
Yeah, I think that she was hoping that we could that she could duplicate a call contact to a case note, but it seems like Patty was asking the same exact question, but it seems like that's not an option. But you can duplicate case notes if you.
Yeah, you can duplicate case notes, and I want to clarify too. So this is definitely open for further conversation if you totally don't agree with me. But like if Joan phones the shelter while she's staying at the shelter, so say she's just out for the day, she's at work, and she phones the shelter, that's recorded as a case note and not a call contact. And so I just want to make that distinction, and I don't know if it's relevant to the question, but that does come up a lot about when is something a call contact and when is it a case note. And anything that's client related would be documented under case notes typically, and then calls contacts would be non-clients. So because Joan was discharged from shelter once and then phoned back requesting space, she was technically a non-client at the time of her call. So it got documented as a call contact. And it's just, from my point of view, it's kind of an important distinction, or it's important to distinguish because there's a different level of accountability when somebody has, consented to services versus when they're just phoning, requesting services.
So Patty has a question. Our program takes a long time to save case notes, much longer than yours. Any idea why? It could be a couple of things that are contributing to that, but what I would ask you to do, Patty, is email otsupport@acws.ca, and then we can set up a request for support and maybe help remedy that situation, because that's certainly not good. So we'll we can take care of that. And I think those were all the questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to double check. I think we did copy an intake form. And so this is at this point, because we have more than one intake form for Joan, this is where we're getting into that point I mentioned early on about managing multiple admissions. Because when we go to the discharge form here, we are going to see both the intakes here. But you'll notice, like, I've defaulted back to the discharge form I've already completed for Joan. So if I'm not careful about linking to the appropriate intake that I want to create a discharge for, what I'm going to do is actually overwrite her previous discharge, and then the wrong information. Well, first of all, we'll have an admission that doesn't have a discharge associated with it, but we'll also potentially have discharge details that aren't connected to the right intake form, and that does get important. Like especially when we're working with women who require a number of shelter stays to change their relationship circumstances. It's important that that thread is made appropriately between the admission, what services were provided and what referrals were made, and then the readmission and what services and referrals were made. It affects, the length of time that's reflected, like in terms of shelter stay. Like there's just a lot of details that get affected if we're not very conscious about selecting the right intake form from this list. And you will never complete a discharge form without an intake form already being in the database. So we request that you guys never select new discharge because that's going to create a discharge form that has no relationship to an intake form, and that doesn't really, from our point of view, make sense.
So we have another question from Helen.
Okay.
She asks, so if I call a client and she does not want to be an outreach client, can a second calls contact be filed because I have called her? So I'm assuming that this client would be a residential client who is being called about maybe being interested in outreach, but is not interested in outreach. Would that be recorded as a call contact or as a case note? I think is what Helen is trying to get at.
Yeah, so I'll kind of review two scenarios. So one scenario is a woman phones the shelter. She wants shelter services. The shelter's full. She's provided a supported referral to outreach, and then the outreach staff person calls her to look at admitting her into the program, but she declines. And so that's one scenario. I think that you'd want to document, and I'm actually going to ask if it's okay if I get back to you on that, because that one, I believe that would be documented as another call contact, but I'm not positive, and I need to consult with my colleagues who have more shelter experience than I do. If anyone else has encountered that scenario and wants to share what their shelter does, that would be really helpful. But otherwise, I can certainly follow up to the group in our follow-up email and provide more detail about what to do in that case. In the other case, if somebody is in a program at your shelter somewhere, I would document that contact about admission to another program as a case note. So like if they're already in shelter and somebody's calling them about outreach while they're in shelter, that to me would be tracked as a case note.
So Helen is saying that she just wants to avoid an intake and discharge, which you wouldn't fill out the outreach intake unless the client was actually interested in receiving services and actually received them anyway.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so either way, whether you record it as a call contact or a case note, unless that person actually receives outreach services, you wouldn't do an intake or a discharge for outreach.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So I'll just kind of close the thread here and click on the admission form that we want to complete this discharge form. So it's the latest one. And fill it out. So I can't put any dates into the future, so I'll just quickly fill this out. All the required questions we've reviewed already.
While you're doing that, I may jump in and say that if you fill out a form and try to save, and you haven't filled out a required form, often the form will give you an error message saying that there's a question that is required that you have not answered. So if you get an error, just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, so right, if you go through the whole form and have missed something, you won't be able to save the form until it's complete. So just yeah, keep that in mind. Okay, so those are the basics, and I'll just review for you. Like if a woman is entering into outreach, the process is very much the same of adding, the outreach role first and ensuring that role date is accurate. Did I add that? Okay. And then your shelter may have a shared intake and discharge form for outreach and shelter. And in that case, you would just have, like in our site, the single intake. You would go back to the form and just use the, sorry, it's taking a second to load, use any like outreach program names and outreach types of programs to complete your form. But it would it's all built into the same activity, so many of the questions are shared, and it will all be quite standard. And then once you, let's see if it'll let me do it, it's probably going to say no. Oh, it works. Once you've made those changes, you'll see that what you just have to be mindful of on the discharge form is choosing the outreach admission to complete your discharge as opposed to the shelter admission. So I've really skimmed over that. If there are any questions, we can dig in a little bit deeper. But you'll see, yeah, so if you're on the outreach tab, if you have two separate tabs, oh right, we have that filter on there now. Yeah, you may see both, or you may see just the outreach. Okay, just going to have a look at my list here. So I think we've touched on all of the basics. If there are any specific assessments or activities that you guys would like to review with the last 15 minutes or so that we have, we can definitely do that. Or we can review anything we've touched on, or we can part early. I know it's been riveting, 3 hours of database training. Yeah, so anything you guys want to touch on, let me know. Otherwise, we can.
So we have a question from Nikki, who asks, do you consider calls from other community resources as a contact or a case note?
So if they're from other community resources, I would document them personally so I would give them an organization record in people organizations, and I would document calls contacts. If the calls are case conferencing calls about somebody you're serving, those to me would be documented as case notes. So if you're partnering or have like a, what's the word I'm looking for? You have a team of professionals supporting a family. That to me, that's case note activity. But if it's just a community partner and it's more like referral based or outside the scope of a single woman's services, then I would document that as a call contact.
So Helen asked a question: order of filling out forms to get the right link at the bottom. So I think that's a good point. I think like a very brief overview of the typical stream of service for a client might be helpful. So first there's the typically first it will be a call contact, and then admission into residential or outreach.
Yeah.
And then case notes around that person's interaction in the program, and then any other sort of activity, like they might do a danger assessment, they might do a PSI, so on and so forth, and then a discharge. And then if they're admitted again, then you start all over. So that would typically be the order: a call contact, admission, case note, and other activities, and then discharge. Would you agree, Kat?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, Ali asks, what about walk-ins? I think she means for call contacts.
Yeah, so there's a question on the call contacts form on our site, and we can double check that it's on your site, but there's actually, where is it? Method of call contact. So many are by phone, but some are in person. So that would be a walk-in. So somebody will walk in. I would say most shelters would still document, even if they went straight to the admission process and like went straight to intake, that method of initiating services is documented on a call contact form, briefly. Because you want to document, like, we had the request for space, and even if we accommodated it like immediately, there's still that logic flow of like, okay, they asked for space, we provided space.
Sarah asks, how do you access the YouTube training videos? Is there a link on the ACWS website? And I'm not certain that there is a link on the ACWS website, but we will be sending follow-up emails to the attendees of this webinar, and we can put a link to the videos in that email, and they're also in the user manual, as Kat is pointing out here.
Yeah. So what page is this? Oh dear. Page 4. So the link is there on page 4. Our email address is there on page 4. And then I will make a note that, in the follow-up email you guys get in the next week or so, we'll address, I think there's one outstanding question, I don't have it off the top of my head, and then provide this link to you guys as well.
And there are also a lot of resources on the YouTube channel. There's a lot of training videos. This video will be up shortly. There's a really in-depth video on the danger assessment, and there's a lot of typical training videos. So there's a lot of resources available to you on that link. So I suggest you. Kat's pulling it up for us.
Yes, here we go. So I think we've got like almost maybe 30 videos, about 30 videos. So yeah, lots of exciting content for you there.
I think that's all of the questions. I don't see any more coming in, so.
Cool.
Yeah. I just want to reiterate that if you have any support requests or need any help with your database or have any questions, otsupport@acws.ca. If you shoot an email that way, we will get it and help you out.
Yeah, and then I also want to point out, so we mentioned we'll do some follow-up calls. I'm going to say, like, it probably won't be next week, but the week after, just, checking in to see if any questions have come up as you apply what we've covered today and what you see in the manual. So expect to hear from us. But if any of you are viewing the webinar with a colleague, and so you won't be tracked as an attendee, because we rely on kind of the email addresses that are attached to whoever's logged on right now. So just shoot us an email at OT support so we know to follow up with you as well, because otherwise we might miss you and we don't want to do that. And then lastly, I just want to thank you guys for participating, and to let you know, I know it's not everybody's favorite part of their role to do data entry, but what you contribute in taking care with your data entry in terms of our collective ability as shelters all across Alberta to improve services and also advocate on behalf of women and staff who work in shelters is greatly appreciated. And it does make a difference. So yeah, thank you so much. And please, if you can, also take a moment to complete the evaluation form at the end of the presentation. It helps us improve our training delivery and serve you guys better. So that's all from me.
Excellent. Thanks for everybody for coming.
Take care.
Yeah.